So I found this article this week, came into my email box from the New York Times, and I just thought it was the perfect one to share for today. The new weddings in India's South expect some magic. The bride-to-be took center stage for the final rehearsal, and confident and experienced star before a grand performance. The backup dancers, a mix of relatives, childhood friends, and professional performers, positioned themselves all around her. The choreographer, a small man with calm swagger and long, thinning hair, ran them through the steps, offering muffled instructions through his COVID-era accessory of 2 face masks. The moves, well, they needed to be more defined. And their fingers, they had to point higher. And their shoulders had to droop more. Meanwhile, family members watched from the windowsill shaded by a coconut tree. An elderly uncle tapped the sofa arm with joy. The Punjab song, a popular Bollywood hit, blared from a small speaker as this wedding party practiced their moves one more time. Weddings in India's South, particularly in the coastal state of Kerala, have transformed into a festival of color and dance. Lots of dance. Unlike those in the north, weddings in the south used to be subdued affairs centered on a feast that, at best, would occasionally include a live band. Now, the ceremonies draw on the latest entertainment from across the country of India, including the breathtakingly fast rhymes of Tamil and Telugu dance music and the colorful costumes and drum beats of Punjab. About 60 to 70% of the weddings in Kerala now include choreographed dances. And choreographer Manas Prem has been commissioned to choreograph 500 weddings in the coming months of this year's wedding season. Sound a little bit over the top? Oh, you should have seen the photos. And there was video, because of course it comes across email, right? Wow, pretty incredible actually. I mean, weddings, after all, are not supposed to be your everyday kind of occasion. But since COVID has limited the size of wedding gatherings in India to a mere 200 people, I mean, I'm told that typically it's more like 1,000, the couples have had to find creative ways to still make their celebrations feel big. And plus, this answer, well, it is perfect for sharing out on social media with the other 800 guests that aren't able to be there in person. But think about it. Think about the ways that we talk about weddings in our own culture. I mean, what do we call it? It's the big day, right? Your big day, in fact. Weddings are, the world over, a new beginning. They're the forming of a young family. They're about the future and the continuity of the entire community. So is it any wonder that we get a bit extravagant in our wedding celebrations? Maybe even, show off a bit. Well, it looks like weddings were not that different in Jesus' time. My social science commentary says that they lasted for days, sometimes up to a full week. And that they were like honorific competitions to provide the best wedding that the village had ever seen. In fact, it tells me the fathers would join mutual aid societies years in advance of their children coming of age. They had names like the sons of the bridal shower. They did this so that they could collectively support each other. And that way, they would each have the backing to pull off that kind of massive social obligation when their own children came of age. It wasn't a private party either It was a huge public event. Brides were lavishly perfumed and adorned in beautiful clothes. And then they were paraded by torchlight across the whole village in a carriage, from their own homes to the home of the groom. Now, during that parade, dances were danced and songs were sung that exaggerated the bride's beauty. And then grain and wine and oil were tossed in front of her along the way. I mean, if you think about it, you can kind of imagine that kind of wedding showing up in the wedding pages of the New York Times, too, don't you think? In fact, it would probably look great on social media. So why, then, would John's gospel choose that kind of party atmosphere for Jesus' first act of public ministry? I mean, it's not particularly spiritual. It's more earthly and set in the day-to-day life of people. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the other three gospels, well, they all portray Jesus as preaching in a synagogue for his public ministry debut in their tellings of Jesus' life and ministry. In fact, John is the only evangelist who includes the wedding of Cana's story at all in his gospel. So this must really matter to John. It must be a really important way that he is unveiling Jesus to us, because he chooses to use this as the way to show us for the first time who Jesus is and what he came to do. So let's dig in deeper into the story. Now, don't you just love how this story unfolds? You can kind of feel how, I don't know, a little bit green Jesus is. I mean, he is not yet that local superstar that's famous wherever he goes and has the adoring crowds following him. Jesus as John is generally portrayed as fully aware of who he is and what his mission and purpose here on earth is throughout John's gospel. But this particular episode kind of portrays him more like, a recalcitrant teenager who's just coming up with excuses to not have to play that well-practiced piano piece during the family gathering, right? Feels that way to me anyway. Instead, it's Mary, his mother, who is absolutely certain that this is what Jesus is meant to be doing in this particular moment. And even their interaction, well, it is straight out of the mundane and repetitive pages of family life. I mean, you can just hear echoes of this kind of thing. Mom, there's dishes in the sink. Son, don't feel like doing it right now. Mom, I'll expect the dishwasher to be full and running by the time I get back from the grocery store. Mom walks away, and the noise of dishes clattering together starts up in the kitchen. I mean, we've all been through those kinds of interactions with our kids, right? Yep, when John says that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling place among us, John certainly understood this to include all of that kind of day-to-day stuff. All the not-so-divine ways that human beings just, live our lives. And yet John chooses that kind of interaction to open up this whole episode that he lifts up and names as the first sign that reveals God's glory in Jesus, God's glory. And also, John does not call this a miracle. He's very specific. It's a sign. It's a sign that proclaims, look here. You're going to see who Jesus is and hence who God is also. In the midst of this very, very human interaction and day in life. And you know what? What an incredible sign it was. 6 clay purification jars holds about 180 gallons of liquid. That's something like 1,000 bottles of wine. That's a lot, right? Can Can you imagine? I mean, and it's not just any wine either. It is the best wine that they have had in their entire week of revelry. Jesus is, well, going over the top, just to show us how God goes overboard for us. Now, you might be tempted to think that God's revealing his son as some sort of Dionysus here, who came to egg us on in all of our human excesses. Well, John scholar Carolyn Lewis points out in the literary structure of the gospel that this is not the case. The other signs in this gospel help lead us to, in fact, a much more likely conclusion. Because all of the other signs that we get in John's gospel, it's like the greatest hits of Jesus' ministry. 3 very public healings, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, and the raising of Lazarus. And for each one of those signs, John has Jesus explain exactly what the sign is showing us about who he is and who God is. He does that just to be sure that nobody misses the point. So, where then is the explanation for this sign? Because, you know what? It kind of looks like it's missing. Well, Lewis's theory is that it's in fact in the preceding chapter. Chapter 1 of John's Gospel, which is the famous, "In the beginning was the Word," a prologue. It's a chapter that functions in John's Gospel as sort of like the handbook for understanding the entire thing. Now, in particular, Lewis directs our attention to verses 14 and 16, where we're told that Jesus is full to overflowing with the very heart of who God is. It's something that John calls grace. Now, this overflowing of God and God's very essence right there in Jesus, it means that not only can we plainly see who God is by what Jesus does, but it also means that there is plenty of this godness, this love, this overflowing of abounding grace, all there for us too. There's so much of it that it is called by John grace upon grace. I mean, you can just see the imagery overflowing there. Now, I know this is some pretty thick theology for us to wade through today, but that's John's gospel for you. You just kind of have to do it. But you know the other great thing about John's gospel is that it doesn't just tell us the technicalities of how God is manifest in Jesus and what that might mean for us. It also shows us. It shows us in ways that make this abundant grace upon grace real and obvious, because as we read through John's gospel, we get to experience exactly what grace upon grace looks like and acts like every time we see something happen in Jesus' life. So what does this mean for us today? Well, I think that it means that we too can recognize all of the ways that God's abundant grace upon grace is overflowing in our own lives. Through Jesus, we can meet the very heart of God and all that that love holds and has in store for us. In the case of this particular reading, God has abundant grace upon grace right there for us, and we get to experience what it smells like and even what it tastes like, because that's the smell and taste of 1,000 bottles of the very best wine, free-flowing in a communal celebration of love and family, covenant, and the promise of new life together. And it's the kind of celebration that has a most generous host. But it's also the kind of celebration that took everyone in town to contribute and cook and prepare that feast. In fact, 6 water jars, I'm told, 1 per household would be the norm. So to have 6 water jars there, it meant that everybody in the neighborhood, or a bunch of people around the neighborhood, had to bring theirs to help support and make this day happen. Grace upon grace comes from God, But it also seems to involve, well, a bit of a potluck on our part too. When we receive the overflowing love from God, there is plenty left over for us to share. In fact, there's cases and cases of it. And you know what? If we kept all of that for ourselves, well, we just end up drunk, right? I think that that's why this gospel gets paired with that wonderful reading from 1 Corinthians. Now, we shift to Paul, different writer, different time, and he's using language of spiritual gifts instead of this idea of abundant grace upon grace. But you know what? I think it's pretty much talking about the same thing, about how God is pouring his love and his heart and his being and all of that into us. It's overflowing through Jesus, and that means that we can share it with everyone. And in case we missed that point, Paul closes his argument by saying, use those spiritual gifts that you've been given for the common good. They are not there just for you to show off and make yourself feel important. Now, I also think that all of this high celebratory image of a wedding, well, it's actually a really great way to think about how we are launched into what will be a very rich, complex, and lifelong spiritual journey with God in Jesus. Jesus' life and ministry, well, it wasn't all a party by any stretch. But that grace upon grace, it carried him through even the roughest moments when he struggled to feel it's flowing from God. So it's the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend. And I cannot close without giving you a few words of his own eloquent writing today. So I've chosen for you what he said once as a young pastor, officiating one of his first marriage ceremonies. This was written to the young couple. Today, you become heirs of a legacy of togetherness. Together you will dream dreams. Together you will make plans. Together you will face moments of unutterable joy. Together you will face moments of inexpressible sorrow. Despair not when the inevitable moments of personality adjustment arise, for they may be stepping stones to higher levels of self-completion. Be not dismayed when the buoyancy of fulfillment is transformed into the fatigue of disappointment, for this is part of the changing scenery of life. Like the ever-flowing water of the river, life has its moments of drought and its moments of flood. Love, trust, loyalty, and mutual respect are the pillars upon which the temple of marriage must be built. If these elements are there, the storms may come and the winds may blow, but they will not upset the temple of your marriage, for it is founded upon a solid rock. So, stepping back to that wonderful story that we heard about all the weddings this year in southern India, we can remember how, as COVID stretched on and limited the size of wedding parties, well, people there, they found a new way to make a big celebration, to go with the abundant promise of life and love and future that a marriage symbolizes for a family and for the whole community. And we ourselves can see and hear and almost taste the joy of overflowing, despite all of the challenges that took to get them to their day. Even in the middle of some of the most trying times, we are facing ever, as in our lives, possibly even in some eras of humanity, well, it reminds us that there is still good wine there for us all. That's because Jesus went overboard to show us how God is always going over the top for us. And I think that's our calling today. to be reminded to recognize and receive and share God's abundant grace upon grace each and every day of our life in Jesus. So you know what? Go ahead. Dance, sing, be a little bit showy. Put on beautiful, colorful silk garments and invite everyone that you know so that you can have this kind of over-the-top celebration of how much God loves us. Especially right now in the midst of times like this, not only can we, but we must continue to find creative ways to let all of that abundant grace upon grace that we receive through Jesus flow from us out into our community and into the whole world. Amen.